The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. That's the starting point for most of us when we become really seriously interested in learning about the philosophy and practice of yoga. And in this study of the Yoga Sutras, most of us run into concepts and ideas that are at least unfamiliar and also, for the most part, unrelated to the practice that we do. So the great challenge getting at the heart of the Yoga Sutras is to understand how these sutras lead us to a practice that's useful to us. That's what we'll try to talk about a little bit, at least, today. The Yoga Sutras are a set of aphorisms. They're divided into 4 chapters. In those 4 chapters, the first and the second chapter are the most important and most practical. The third and fourth are interesting, but very abstract. These 2 first chapters, one on Samadhi, the goal of yoga, and one on sadhana, the practice of yoga, these 2 great chapters of yoga inspire anyone who really reads them deeply to involve themselves even more with their own practice. They begin with a very well-known and oft-repeated sutra, Atta Yoganushasanam. Anushasanam means the traditional method of teaching. Yoga, of course, means yoga. Atta means now, but atta is also a word that implies a blessing. We are blessed to begin the study of yoga, or now we begin the study of yoga. With that opening, Patanjali launches into some of the greatest sutras in the literature of yoga. These sutras describe what is yoga and what it is not, and how to practice, or at least how to recognize the outcome of practice. The second sutra reads, Yogash Chittavritti Nirodha. It's an amazing sutra, but one that's quite difficult for English speakers to translate. Yogash, of course, means yoga. Chittavritti means operations of the mind. But Nirodha, that's a difficult word. It's been translated as controls or suppresses. I think perhaps the easiest and best translation is simply mastery. Mastery of the operations of the mind. Yoga is the mastery of the operations of mind. The odd thing for us as Western students is to try to understand what the mastery of operations of the mind actually might mean. Are they stuffed into a bag and put into the corner of a room? Or is your mind suddenly void of all thoughts and operations? It's not quite clear what those operations, control of those operations will lead to. The next sutra, the third sutra, Tada Drashtuhu Swarupe Vastanam, means then, when the mind has been mastered, when the operations of mind are mastered, then the self, the seer, dwells in its own nature. So there's something remarkable about mastering the mind. Then something deeper within us rests and abides in its own nature. And it's that is ultimately the goal of yoga. At other times, however, vritti sarupyam itaratra. At other times, I identify myself with the operations of mind rather than being their master. And when I identify myself with those operations of mind, I find myself pushed and pulled, shoved and chaotically drawn away from my own focus. And I lose track of who I am as a being, as a spiritual being. So the goal of yoga somehow leads from this second sutra. Yoga is the mastery of the vrittis, or the operations of mind, to a recognition that then the self dwells in its own nature, and also a recognition that when that's not happening, when the mind is not mastered, then the self becomes chaotic, confused, and identified with things which it is ultimately not. This great journey, of course, needs explanation. There is a commentator on the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali whose name is Viyasa. And he not only comments on the sutra after it's been recited, but in a sense he raises questions about what the direction of the next sutra might be. So Viyasa raises the question, after these first 4 sutras that we've just discussed, he raises the question, what are those chittavrittis? What are the operations of mind that need to be controlled? And he lists 5. Valid thinking, invalid thinking, abstract thinking, sleep, and memory. Somehow he suggests that if we're going to manage the chittavrittis, then it's these 5 operations of mind that need to be controlled. And yet, when we think about how it is that we might control them, it's not so clear what he means. It's not clear unless we understand that there is a fundamental reality to practice that both Patanjali and Viyasa are simply accepting as the norm. And we'll need to too if we're going to understand how these Yoga Sutras unfold. The basic thing that Viyasa and Patanjali assume is that the practitioner of yoga is practicing meditation. Mastering the chittavrittis, mastering the operations of mind, means that my mind is no longer distracted or distractible, that I allow my mind to rest in its focus and then gradually transcend itself. So this operation, mastery of the operations of the mind, leads to a transcendent awareness that's acquired through meditating. And if we're going to master these 5 chittavrittis, valid and invalid thinking and all the rest, we'll need to meditate ourselves. We'll have to see how our own thoughts emerge in the midst of meditation and try to carry us away, and what we can do to prevent that, and how we can gradually gain mastery of those tendencies of mind. It may help in a certain way if we also explore these 5 chittavrittis, operations of mind, in a little different way. Most of us are familiar with the idea that the mind passes through 3 states of awareness: waking, dreaming, and sleep. By sleep, Patanjali means deep sleep, dreamless sleep. So the mind passes through waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. What are the chittavrittis involved in waking states of consciousness? Valid thinking, invalid thinking, abstract thinking, and a portion of memory, the kind of memory that comes back to us when we want to remember something. What are the kinds of vrittis that are involved in dreaming? That's a different kind of memory, but it's still memory. Memories arising during our sleeping hours. And what sorts of vrittis are responsible for sleep? Of course, it's simple: sleep. So a practitioner of yoga is a practitioner who's working on managing these 5 vrittis, or put it a different way, these 3 states of mind during the course of their meditation practice. And that's how we have to really begin to understand the Yoga Sutras. Much of what follows in the Yoga Sutras is a discussion of how you go about managing those chittavrittis, those operations of mind, and also some special features of managing that make the job easier for us. It takes someone who has been through the Yoga Sutras many times to get some sense of how they unfold. And I'm really here to encourage you to buy a copy of the Yoga Sutras, read them, and then go back and read them again. But it's interesting, in Sutra 12, a little ways further down the road, Viyasa asks the question to Patanjali, how are these chittavrittis actually managed? And Patanjali answers the question in the most simple and profound way. He says, by concentrating the mind through practice and by non-attachment. These two great strategies really lie at the heart of the Yoga Sutras. It's the practice of meditation that Patanjali is talking about when he describes the control of vrittis as being accomplished through practice. Meditation practice means resting the mind in one thing. The thing in which the mind is rested requires some attention as well. I remember listening to Swami Rama, the founder of the Himalayan Institute, and hearing him say often that the choice of one's focus is an important choice in meditation. He often recommended that a person learn first to follow the breath, but gradually he almost always arrived at the idea of resting the mind in a mantra, in a sound. Whether it's breath or whether it's mantra, however, the thing, the object in which the mind rests, is called an alambana. An alambana is a support for the mind. And when the mind is supported by an alambana, it can become one-pointed, focused, restful. Non-attachment, the other method Patanjali suggests for mastering the mind, is a somewhat difficult concept for us to grasp. As we try to understand what non-attachment is, we run into the idea, in our culture at least, that attachment is a good thing. And so we wonder, why non-attachment? Attachment seems to be the kind of thing that creates a bond between a mother and a child, or between a husband and a wife, or between two friends. So what sort of thing is meant by Patanjali when he says non-attachment leads to control? Well, the answer really revolves around a simple idea, that when attachment becomes misleading, that is, when I imagine that the thing that I love or want is the only source of my happiness, then inevitably it also leads to imbalance. And imbalance is precisely the thing which Patanjali is recommending not to do. So this great teacher of yoga says, practice one-pointedness of mind and maintain balance. Have the idea that how you live your life is not for the sake of happiness found outside, but found inside. Which makes sense to most of us after we've studied yoga for a while. We begin to get the idea that the study of happiness involves finding our happiness inside ourselves. This is not quite the end of the sutras by any means. Patanjali goes on and he describes how it is that a relationship with the infinite and resting the mind in a mantra can be powerful ways to overcome the distractions that lead us away from ourselves. He further goes on and he talks about how it is that the mind can be made more stable and what are the steps that lead to the highest states of consciousness. These are marvelous and powerful sutras, well worth reading again and again. But they bring us to the conclusion of Chapter 1, Pada 1 of the Yoga Sutras. There's a second chapter, and we need to pay a little bit of attention to that in order to grasp what is at the heart of yoga and Yoga Sutras. The second chapter begins with a discussion of the concept of karma. And it suggests that when attachment, when our own hope that we ourselves can be the focus of happiness, not some balanced inner state of being, but what we want, that when what we want dominates our thinking and colors our behavior, it likely will also create impressions in the unconscious mind. And so Patanjali goes on in the second chapter to discuss what is the nature of that unconscious mind? How does it hold those impressions, and how do those impressions mislead us in directing our life into the future? Because Patanjali is very clear, it's the future happiness that is in our hands, and it's the future karma which we have some control over. So Patanjali goes on then in the second chapter and discusses how is it possible to manage ourselves in such a way that our future happiness is guaranteed. Again, he comes back to the concept of meditation. How is it possible that meditation can free us from the bondage of our own restrictions and attachments? And then finally, he makes an interesting shift. He says, given all of this philosophy and understanding of the nature of meditation, is there some way for us as beginning level students to move forward in our practice? And the outcome of that question is the discussion, a long discussion really, on the 8 limbs of yoga, Ashtanga Yoga. This begins in Sutra 28 of the second pada. And in discussing that section, he walks us through each of the yamas and niyamas, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, samadhi. Each of these steps is one important element in the overall far-reaching goal of yoga. So for the moment at least, we've summarized what is the Yoga Sutras, how they unfold in both in theory and in practice. And I think that might be a good place for us to stop. But let me remind you that your own reading is as important as listening to this lecture. And as you ponder these great sutras on your own, you may find yourself wanting to return to them again and again. Thank you.